Hello, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of episode 11, part 2, as you saw. Now, this time we are going to move finally from terra, the way that we were last time, talking about the stones, into paradise. Now, before we had left off at the altar, so we will continue up in the altar space, looking at the mosaic tiles. Now, the thing about these mosaics is that they are, in this church, as well as in many churches in Italy, very much a symbol of Eastern and Western artistic practices, as well as artistic elements and symbols very much coming together. And this church is very much shows that. First things first, so we have in this mosaic, as we can see, a very gold background with a few figures in it. It's very reminiscent, actually, of mosaics that we find in San Marco. As you can see in this image, the entire interior is covered in this particular artistic style, artistic measure. And it is, of course, an artistic form that comes from the combination, specifically from the Byzantine Empire, the practice of encasing gold and various other stone materials and so forth in glass. And in Venice, that's also where we get our very first glass ovens. They say come from, on Murano, they say come from the Byzantines needing to make glass tiles for these various ceilings. We also have them here, though. Again, we are in the Cappella Palatina. We see these mosaics covering the walls, covering the aisles on either side of the nave, and really covering absolutely everything, as much of the church as possible, except the ceiling. And again, this is very particular to the Cappella Palatina, and someday we will talk in great detail about the special art forms found on that particular ceiling. Now, moving on again to the back to Santa Maria Assunta, we have here in the altar space, we can see this golden mosaic. We have all of the apostles here in a lower ring there, as they are closer to earth, but they are very nicely lined up, in a very angular fashion. And right above them, above the window, directly above the throne, we must remember, is the Virgin Mary. Now, this is not just any Virgin Mary. This is very much, this is a Byzantine Mary. This is a Byzantine post-iconoclasmic Mary. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because, as you notice, she is standing here on this platform holding Christ. This is a Theotokos Mary, by the way. That has to do with the Byzantine icon and the way that she is holding Christ, the way that she is standing, which, by the way, is an icon type that comes out of iconoclasm. As we can see, the incredible starkness of the mosaic, there is nothing else around her. She is surrounded by the pure gold of the heavens, and our viewpoint is drawn directly to her. There is nothing else really to see. And she comes from, actually, this mosaic that we're looking at now, that we're zooming into. And this particular mosaic, again, comes from none other than Holy Wisdom herself, Hagia Sophia. But as you'll notice from this mosaic, Mary is not only enthroned herself, but she's also surrounded by various saints, even though this mode of Mary holding Christ is very similar. It is a little bit different. This is pre-iconoclasmic imagery, where we are able to see almost a more human side of Mary. But the imagery, as we saw in Assunta, is much more symbolic. Mary inhabits a golden space that is roughly three-dimensional based on the platform that she's standing on, but beyond that, there really has no dimensions. And again, there's a true starkness to the art form, just like we saw in the columns, right, where in the post-iconoclasmic era, we had just the symbol of the cross. We had nothing else really to consider. And again, in this case, we have Mary inhabiting this space. Now, another interesting thing in Assunta, and again, we see this in other churches, especially in the Cappella Palatina, we have this inscription around Mary. And this inscription is actually showing Mary as a symbol of virtue and salvation, and this particular inscription shows Christ's dual nature and compassion towards sinners. Now, the thing about these inscriptions, though, is that they are done in a mixture of Greek and Latin. So again, we're really sure that there were Byzantine and there were probably Greek artisans and artists here making these mosaics at this time. Now we can also see from this plan of the church here, so the central bay that you're seeing is the bay to the altar. And it's said that there are other mosaics that are also to be found specifically in the southern chapel, which is actually this chapel here. Many pieces of the church are under various kinds of restoration and being worked on by various groups. So there are I don't have images of those mosaics, but there are more mosaics there that describe some Eastern, some Western symbology. Now, turning in the central aisle towards the door of the church, facing the Theotokos Mary, a very Byzantine symbol, we have this massive Last Judgment image, which, as it turns out, is in fact a Western image, not an Eastern image, even though it is done in using a Byzantine technique of these particular mosaics and in a bit of a Byzantine style. This image is in fact a Western image, and it portrays also how within this church we have potentially Byzantine artisans, potentially Byzantine patrons, potentially Byzantine parishioners, even at that time. However, we also have Latin ones as well. And this is showing a bit of their art form. Now, this is a very interesting Last Judgment image. Let's get into it. So at the top here, we have actually a crucifixion image of Christ, and the musculature of Christ, the way that his body is defined, is actually incredibly Latin. It's incredibly Western, the way that this particular crucifixion image is portrayed. Even though it still appears very symbolic, it is actually done in a very Western style. And immediately underneath this image, we have an Ascension image, which is also rather Western as well. Following this, then we have the Last Judgment in these last three parts, and we see Christ in this centermost image with the mandorla around him. Now, there's some very interesting things about how this is stacked and how this is organized. So, as we can see here, we are back to the main image of the Last Judgment scene, this incredibly layered scene. And so we can see, as I pointed out at the top, we have crucifixion, which then moves on to this panel here of the Ascension, which then moves on to the panels of the Last Judgment. So we have actual Judgment Day happening here. And then we have the weighing of the souls underneath it, which is actually a very Byzantine image. The fact that it's been included here in this way is a very Byzantine method. And then we have heaven and hell. And what's interesting also about this is the way that it's designed. So we actually have we can see from this line a particular, the evolving of Christ, right? From the very earthly as in the crucifixion to the Ascension, his becoming, his entering the world of the spiritual, and then Judgment Day when he is securely in the realm of the spiritual, and he assumes the position of Christ, the judge. Another interesting thing, though, that we have here, we have this red fiery river that is coming directly from the mandorla, as we can see from this line, and is taking us directly into hell. And what's interesting about this is how it is actually a bit that kind of fiery river coming from the mandorla of Christ, reminiscent of this icon here, which comes from Sinai in Egypt, and therefore very much belongs to the world of Eastern Christianity, not Western Christianity. So that's very particular to that kind of portrayal of hell. But then again, as we see here in the Basilica of Sant'Angelo in Formis, we have actually a very similar Last Judgment kind of scene that is layered with the central mandorla like this, and is very much in this stratified style. It's also mentioned that the figures are a bit similar, and this is very much coming from the Latin and Western world, which is very interesting because it would seem like this mosaic might be more of a Last Judgment instead from the Byzantine world, and it turns out it's very much a mix. Another thing that we see here in these images, so we're actually looking at depictions of Hades, not of the devil, which is really fascinating. Again, we're having actually a semi-Western, semi-Eastern mythology, but specifically a mythology that is classical. And what's interesting about that is that, in a way, this does actually appear at times in the Romanesque era because it is after the Carolingian Renaissance. And this isn't necessarily coming from the Franks per se, but it is definitely a classical image. So we see, for example, we see Hades here. He appears, this is the ascension scene, right? He appears as the god of the underworld who is being trampled by the ascension of Christ. And we can also see here in the language of medieval art that we can tell that Christ is ascending because his person is physically bigger than those around him. This is language actually of the Romanesque era that would translate again into the Gothic era, even into some parts of the early Renaissance, where points of depth wouldn't necessarily be considered, not because they couldn't be considered, but because there was very much at that point several hundred years worth of a practice in art of making more important figures physically larger. But we also can see here in the Last Judgment scene, we can see Hades is over here as the keeper of hell. And it would stand to reason probably that this river might be very similar to the river that is described by Dante, but I'm not entirely sure on that point. And finally, to conclude, another point that is described as a combining of Eastern versus Western artistic and symbolic traditions, we actually have the presence of a saint who comes from the French, not from Italy. It's very similar to the presence of Joan of Arc in Monreale in Sicilia, which is unusual considering that those are Greek mosaics, yes, but Joan of Arc was a French and a British saint, and she was included in the church because the church was being built for Normans, as the original church of Torcello, as I mentioned, was built by the Carolingians. It's very, very faint to see here, but this is actually a ruin of the original church, and we can see a fresco here that depicts Saint Martin of Tours, who is actually an important saint in Venice, likely because of the Carolingian presence, but also due to presences that would appear later on. So as you've seen, this church, along with many other churches that I have shown you, is not in any way alone. It's very much part of a medieval type that is very specific to Italy, that is a combined type of the Middle Ages. It combines so many parts, so many different empires, so many different groups of people who were coming around this area, roaming around this area, entering different parts, conquering different parts, participating in different politics in various times. All of their art influences can be found here, and it creates a very special composite Middle Ages that you really don't find exactly in this way in anywhere else in the world. And in this sense, it's a very extraordinary phenomena. These are very extraordinary monuments that have been studied, that must continue to be studied, to be understood, how they were made, why they were made the way that they were made, and what makes this Middle Ages so particular and so special in its own right. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you on my next episode. See you soon.